Hey, Shadows listeners. If you're looking to make some extra income that also impacts people, then you need to look at becoming a certified leadership coach with Giant. If you don't already know, Giant has been in the leadership space for over 13 years. I got certified through Giant in 2018, and I've been teaching ever since. Just to give you some context, they used to own and operate the John Maxwell brands. They ran the LeaderCast conferences where Jim Collins, Henry Cloud, Malcolm Gladwell, and Simon Sinek, just to name a few, were regular speakers. They have over 500 coaches worldwide, working in over 127 countries, and are being hired by companies like Google, Chick-fil-A, Pfizer, Delta, and more. And yes, you can do this too. I know this might sound intimidating, but Giant will literally give you everything you need to start your own coaching business from scratch. You get hands-on training from top-level coaches to learn the exact methodology and tools that six-figure coaches are using. You get an all-in-one online platform to run your entire coaching business, even if you want to work 100% remotely. And you'll get to join a thriving community of coaches from all around the world. To get started, Giant is hosting a coaching business workshop to help you learn the ins and outs of how to build a successful coaching business. This is both for experienced coaches, consultants, and those who are looking to start coaching and consulting with little to no experience. If you want to hear the really good news, this whole workshop, it's free, 100% free. And you can reserve your spot by going to giant.tv/shadows. Why not give it a shot? What's better than making a positive change in people's lives and making some extra money in the process? Giant launches a new hiring cohort every month. Now, they only have 20 coaching slots available each month, so it's first come, first serve. So go ahead and make sure you reserve your spot. If you're ready to make an impact and get paid doing it, go to giant.tv/shadows, giant.tv/shadows.
I'm Scott Mason, co-host of Just a Squirrel Looking for a Nut, Trying to Get Out of This Rut, a live stream podcast every Thursday at 7:15 Eastern Time on Facebook and LinkedIn Live. I'm here with my co-host, Oleg Lohid. I want to make sure that you're on the lookout for Rise from the Shadows season finale. It's for 2 days on December 22nd and 23rd. 2 episodes, 6 guests. It's not to be missed. www.theshadowspodcast.com.
Welcome everyone to a special Black Friday edition of Rise from the Shadows. We are about to wrap up season 1, but before we do so, we want to welcome Scott Mason back to the Shadows. During this episode, Scott tells the story of listening to Leroy Garvin playing his harp at his mother's church every 4th Sunday while singing A Motherless Child. That song resonated with him as an adopted child. Scott discusses his journey from being born in England as Calvin Fronz Crowdey to being adopted by an African-American family and moving to Kansas. He struggled to come to terms with not being wanted by his family and was raised in an environment that opposed his destiny. He often wondered what his life would be like if he was still Calvin. When he was 12 years old and his family was on vacation in Denver, he walked into a bookstore and a cover spoke to him. It was a book on Greek mythology. The theme of heroes rising from adoption was not uncommon in this book, and he could relate to Perseus and Moses. This book gave him a sense of hope and allowed him to face the monsters that he would eventually have to slay in life and be able to overcome his shadows. Scott also encourages us to find our personal avatar through Greek mythology. Check out all episodes of These Shadows Podcast over at theseshadowspodcast.com. Also, make sure you check out Scott Mason's Purpose Highway at purposehighway.com. And also, he and myself are part of the Just a Squirrel Looking for a Nut family every Thursday night at 7:15 Eastern Time on Facebook Live and LinkedIn. So check us out. We always have a good time on there. Folks, go ahead and enjoy this episode of Rise from the Shadows featuring Scott Mason.
When I was a little kid, I went to my mother's church every Sunday. It was an African Methodist Episcopal church that had great music. Some of that music was performed by a choir, but every fourth Sunday there was a special treat. There was a man named Leroy Garvin who would have nothing but some sort of harp instrument that he would put on his lap. It was a small harp. I don't know exactly what it was called, maybe an electric harp. And he would sing in his deep baritone, almost Paul Robeson-ish sort of voice, a song that I love, A Motherless Child. I believe it was a Negro spiritual about being without a parent as an allegory for the misery of slavery and being away from Africa. His song stayed with me. It stirred my heart every time I heard him say it. And whenever he sang that, it was a real treat for the whole set of months between then and when he last sung it. That song always spoke to me because I was adopted. And because I was adopted, a lot of times I felt like a motherless child. I was born in London, England, to a British woman who was in graduate school studying linguistics. She had an affair with a man who was in law school, who was an immigrant from Trinidad. And because they were both in graduate school and because they were of different races, when a child popped out, specifically me, they ultimately decided to give it up. Interestingly enough, I was originally given a completely different name. Calvin Fronz Crowdey was the person who I originally was. When I was put up for adoption, I ultimately ended up being adopted by a couple of African Americans from the United States. And they flew me across the ocean and raised me in Kansas. As a child who was biracial and really on the less African American-ish looking spectrum, I didn't fit in well with my family, all of whom were visibly African American, including my own sister. And because of that, there were amongst certain members of my family pretty clear statements that were made that I really wasn't one of the family, both as an adoptee and someone who looked visibly different. And as I matured and it became apparent that I was LGBTQ, those separations in the connection with the family became, in many cases, far more dramatic and more pronounced. I often would sit and wonder what it would have been like if I had been raised in England with my biological mother as Calvin Fronz Crowdey. I often felt like a motherless child. I'll never forget when I was 12 years old. My family went on a vacation to Denver. And we walked into a bookstore. And there on the shelf, prominently displayed, was a book called Delairy's Greek Myths. Delairy's were the authors. And that cover had a brilliantly bright lithograph of the sun god Helios over a landscape of dancing nymphs. And that illustration of Helios, the sun, drew me, and I bought that book. I still have that book to this day. It's the only book that I still have from my childhood. I read it over and over and over again. And one of the things that I realized in that book was that the theme of a motherless child ran throughout mythology. One of the stories in that book that really affected me was the story of Perseus. He was the hero that slew the Gorgon Medusa. Medusa had snakes for hair. And you might know who she is because if you looked at her, you turned into stone. She was so hideous. But what's not as well known about Perseus is his origin myth. He was the son of a king named Acrisius. Acrisius was told by an oracle that his own son, who later became Perseus, would kill him. But in order to prevent his wife, Danae, from having a child, he locked Danae into a chamber without any light. There was only just a small slot for her to get air and a little bit of sun ray. And he thought that way no one would be able to impregnate her. She sat in that chamber all alone until Zeus saw her and fell in love. He became a golden shower, and that's how he entered through that slot, got her pregnant, and then later Acrisius found out about that pregnancy and made a wooden raft. And he stuck Danae and the child in there. That child floated through a body of water and was found on an island in a different part of Greece and raised. And ultimately, that's what set him on the path to become the hero that he later was. The myth of a hero arising from an adoption is not unique to the Greeks. In the ancient Hebrew Bible, there's the story of the birth of Moses. Moses was born of an Israelite woman. Her and all of the other Hebrew children were in danger, and so she put this child into a little basket and stuck him in the river, and he wafted away, where he was later discovered by the Pharaoh's daughter and raised as an Egyptian prince. There are some themes that I can relate to in this, and that is the idea of a child losing its identity and crossing water. That crossing of water to me represents a symbolic rebirth. And the new identity that the child ultimately has gives them a very special power that comes in handy when they're adults. Later, Moses was banished into the desert. And he, at that point, changed from being this Egyptian prince into the leader who was able to bring the Hebrews out of Egypt and initiate the Exodus into Israel. In the case of Perseus, he later was able to become a hero, and upon killing the Gorgon and also saving a princess named Andromeda in Ethiopia, was able to come back and become the founder of the kingdom of Mycenae, which, by the way, is an incredible place to visit if anyone has a chance to see it. It still exists, and it's unbelievable. As someone who was put in a different sort of basket and crossed water and was given a new identity, the possibilities that shifting identities down the road, that being a motherless child brought me, was never far from my surface. I, like Perseus, was not wanted by my family. I, like Perseus, was raised in an environment that was fundamentally opposed to who and what my destiny was going to be. I always tell folks that I would run through wheat fields just to be by myself for hours. I had a friend named Mike Freeze. We'd put on some cool, fun party music when we were kids, and we'd go out in the patio of my house and we would disco down. And as we disco down, we would imagine some cool metropolis far away where we really were, the Emerald City or Funky Town or something like that. And imagine being different people in that different world. And so when I left Kansas and ultimately began my own journey to become something different and greater than I imagined, or frankly, that anyone ever imagined that I would be, the vision of Funky Town was what I strove for, but the understanding that the past had created an example of how I could change my identity to build a better future was never far from the surface. Growing up in Kansas, in the backwoods, as a child whose family didn't really want him, whose mother was a dog food factory worker, his father worked for the State Highway Patrol, where there just weren't opportunities to really become something big. The idea of doing something that was impactful on a truly large, non-local scale required a complete rejiggering of my identity. The reason why that cover of Helios spoke to me was because Helios represented two things. First of all, every day he represented a journey from the outer rims of the earth that they believed was flat to the top of the sky, and then to the other rim of the earth. He was not afraid to leave where he had begun behind, and in fact did so on a regular basis. But also who and what he was someone whose inner light was so bright that it gave radiance and life to the entire world. Radiance and light to me represented life force, knowledge, love, warmth. That's who I was inside. That was what I believed would be the ultimate fate of the motherless child. I later went to New York City, the ultimate funky town, and I never looked back. As my career progressed, I went through 4 careers. And the first 3 that I went through, I found to be, suffice it to say, the psychological equivalent of the challenges that Perseus had to face as he went on his own journey to become a hero. Along the way, I won't lie to you, there were monsters that I had to slay. Some of the monsters were other people, bosses who were abusive, colleagues who were undercutting, life circumstances that were less than fair. Some were like the ultimate monster, Medusa. Internal monsters that could turn me to stone, could have fossilized my heart. In fact, I would argue that at different points in my career, they did turn my heart to stone. But eventually, those internal monsters, I was also able to behead. Having gone through personal transformation as a child, from Calvin Fronz Crowdey into Scott Mason, had given me the template for slaying something internally. That sounds violent. And I hesitate to come across as though I was seeking to violently damage a part of myself. But the parts of myself that were the shadow, which is what these monsters in the stories represent, did need to be destroyed. In my case, they included negative myths that I was creating for myself about who I was, what my possibilities were, what my worth and value on the planet was, or even professionally, who and what I was to become. I went to law school. A myth was that that's what I had to be in order to be successful. The problem was, as a lawyer, a lot of what I was doing was, especially as a litigator, ripping other people down, tearing other people apart, arguing, destroying, the exact antithesis of what Helios, that god that had inspired me as a child, represented. And it took me multiple iterations to gradually realize that the story that I had told myself about who and what I could be was itself a shadow that was keeping me from hopping into Helios's chariot and rising to the top of the sky, fulfilling my purpose in this universe. Many times, I faced the demon of jealousy. I was envious of others who hadn't had to go through a lot of the things that I went through, who could fit in more easily, who maybe had had original biological parents who loved them, who didn't have to face some of the race-based weirdness that I had to, or the discrimination that was tied to my sexual orientation, or that didn't have to be raised in Kansas in a place that was hostile to who I was, and that offered such little opportunity. But those are part of the heroic journey. Those are the things that have helped my own inner radiance really be able to shine once I conquered that shadow. The interesting thing about who my personal avatar is that the harder I struggled, the more I was able to develop the capacity to push out that light. And in fact, in my current life, there's not a day in which at some point or another, I don't feel fulfilled, radiating out to the world.
You've probably already heard about our upcoming Lima Charlie Network. You might be asking yourself, what exactly does that consist of? Well, the Lima Charlie Network is a group of thought leaders and podcasters with the goals of improving ourselves, inspiring and educating others, and bringing valuable conversations to both military and civilian audiences. Our vision is to empower others to reach new heights in leadership, self-development, and communication by connecting our audience with crucial conversations focused on sharing tools, ideas, and perspectives for impactful improvement. It's a one-stop shop for aspiring and seasoned leaders alike to gain from the experience and knowledge of others. We aren't just a network of colleagues, we're family, and we invite you to join us on this journey. Check us out on Facebook and Instagram at the Lima Charlie Network, and we look forward to delivering valuable information to you loud and clear December 1st. I want to welcome everybody back to Rise from the Shadows here with Scott Mason. That was an awesome brief. So Scott, welcome to Rise from the Shadows.
I'm thrilled to be here.
A couple of quick questions for you. We had you on the Shadows podcast before. And
yes.
Yeah. And so you were definitely one of my people that I circled that I was like, I have to have on here. And you definitely went a different direction than most people have, where they get on and they, it's almost like I like to equate it to most people talk about concepts from like leadership books. You went a little bit different route with yours, which I like. And we talked about this a lot before we even hit record. What can people learn from Greek mythology?
Greek mythology is a body of stories that has lasted for 6,000 years. They shaped the foundations of our culture. So what can they learn? First, they can look at the different lessons that the myths share, the allegories that they represent. And one that is very famous that people talk about all the time is the heroic journey. Mm-hmm. That is, though, just a tip of the iceberg. There is the origin myth, for instance, that's really not about heroism, but it's about explaining who we are foundationally. And that's what I chose to explore this time. They also can provide, through the characters, avatars representing who and what we might be already, but more importantly, who and what is possible, as well as cautionary tales. There are cautionary avatars in Greek mythology that go as to failed kings or vanity or hubristic individuals who end up ultimately destroyed by their character flaws. And these stories about them illustrate the impact of these character flaws in a way that we can psychologically distance from, but still hear. Not to mention they're colorful and exciting. When it comes to the avatars, what I just mentioned earlier, Helios, I've changed it a little bit to the Roman version, Sol Invictus as my avatar, goes as to the qualities that I seek to bring out into the world and that can understand aspirationally when I'm saying who and what do I really want to become? And is it something that has some lasting power? These images, these frameworks that the myths and the characters in them represent haven't stuck around like they have for no reason. They haven't captured the imagination. They're not characters in modern fantasy and superhero stories for no reason. They're powerful.
We always talk about leadership books, but this stuff is, I mean, it stood the test of time. And there are so many, like you said, parallels and allegories that we can, it's almost like a roadmap for our lives if we were to really sit down and study it. Narcissism, I mean, everything's pretty much covered in there. And I thought it was fitting, you know, you were talking about the avatar. What a good personality assessment. Which God do you relate to? And, you know, you mentioned Helios and some of the strengths. I mean, you talk about a parallel with you. First of all, God of Sun, the light that you bring into even a Zoom session is so fitting. But some of the strengths: powerful, fiery brightness, and tireless. That is Scott Mason, if I've ever heard it. And you know, and last thing, you know, to ask you here is, well, two questions. First, what book recommendation would you have for our listeners, especially if they're like, I got a little itch now to learn more about Greek mythology? What is a good book you can recommend to them?
Start with Edith Hamilton's book, Mythology. It's the basic primer. It's well written. It's not dated. And it actually contains some Norse mythology too, which is related symbolically and as a matter of allegory, but comes, of course, from a completely different tradition. But she's thorough, she's comprehensive, and you'll leave there at least understanding what you're reading. There's a lot to dig in afterwards.
Okay. And then also, let our listeners know where they can find you out in the podcast universe and any and everything Scott Mason.
Thank you. The central hub for anything and everything Scott Mason is purposehighway.com. That's purposehighway.com. Scott Mason's Purpose Highway is the name of my podcast, although I am the co-host of a live stream with someone whose name shall be unmentioned, but he's been known to rise from the shadows. And that live stream is on Facebook and LinkedIn Live, 7:15 Eastern Time every Thursday. It's called Just a Squirrel Looking for a Nut. I don't know if you know anyone who's involved with that besides me, but I might be looking at him right now.
I didn't have my squirrel shirt, but I got my Bucky's
shirt
on right now.
I know. I need to work on getting you that squirrel shirt. That's on me.
Until then, it's going to be a Bucky's shirt to try.
I'm down with that.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, if y'all get a chance, check us out. It is so much fun. Casey Berman's on there. Oleg's on there.
Absolutely.
With the minus me, stacked group of people who are on there, and it's just good conversation. If y'all haven't been able to check out an episode, and there's some loyal listeners on there too.
Yes.
Participate in the chat.
Yes.
It's a fun time, and we bring up different topics and we just go on there and discuss it. It's fun. So definitely check us out. Well, Scott, last comments for our listeners.
The sky is the limit in terms of your own possibilities. And as frightening as it can be to leave who and what you thought you might be behind, if you're able and willing to do that and write a new future for yourself, the epic story of your life could be unimaginable.
Thank you so much. You know, I'm a huge fan of you. Someone I consider a good friend, especially
absolutely.
Silver lining from this pandemic was relationships like this.
Exactly.
Folks, go check out his podcast. You will be highly entertained. I promise you. And not just that, you're going to learn so much, you know, just about yourself, just listening to his stuff. So Scott, thank you. Folks. Thank you. That is going to conclude this episode of Rise from the Shadows.